What's up internet, I'm back and today I'm working on the C30 chassis notch. So at this point I've basically got the rails all prepped, boxed in, outside plates and internal gussets all tacked in position where they need to be. So I thought I'd just give you a quick look at it before I go any further, adding some bracing and doing the welding and strapping. So let's take a look. The notch has been designed and drawn by me, then sent to laser cut as per the customer's specifications for what he wants to use the vehicle for in the type of airbag he wants to use. It's eventually going to be a bag over diff setup with the airbag underneath the notch, not on the bridge through the center or the top side of the notch. So that's why the notch is the size it is. It's actually quite big. Along with the fact that it's a bit of a strange style chassis, that's the lowest point of the chassis right there underneath the cab, then steps up and steps again into the notch. If you're curious on what these offcuts of PFC on the floor here are for, I'm using those as a counterweight. So basically the rear half of the chassis is on legs, squared and leveled at a certain height, and I've stitched these pieces of PFC to the legs to use as a counterweight, because once I start welding and do weld the whole rear of this chassis with all the strapping, the chassis is actually going to want to bow upwards. If you look here at this Hilux on the table, you can see that the rear half of the chassis from where the notch has been welded is sort of kicked upward. So the reason for that counterweight is to stop that from happening and keep the chassis where it actually needs to be and where it should be. Here you go. Thanks. So these are templates of the airbag we're going to use. This is bag at full bump and this is bag at full lift. 90mm here versus 320. You can see the size of this airbag is absolutely ginormous, but it suits the application. In comparison to an RE6, obviously this isn't at bump or lift, it's just in its sort of standard state, but you can see the comparison in the size of the airbags. So it's been designed around that airbag to suit what the customer wants. I've designed the notch around my engineer, he's happy with it. So let's get into it, we'll grab the glue gun and we'll keep putting it together. Okay, so where it's at to this point is I've added bracing through the center and I've taken off the bracing which I had on the underside of the chassis rail, which also doubled as a base point for when I was assembling the notch plates. I've welded the underside of the chassis rail front and back, and I've also welded the internal gussets for the notches. The way it's all designed is pretty much the same as any other notch. It's got slots in the outside plates to locate the internal gussets and you weld them externally. I also weld one face internally, I don't weld both faces, purely because it's extra heat and distortion it doesn't need. Not to say it will, but welding both faces could cause the outside plates to narrow, which you'll notice once the strapping goes on. So that's where it's at. We'll get into welding the top side internally and then we will start strapping. So let's keep plugging away. That's all now welded internally, and I've also gone through with a chisel and a wide brush just to clean the spatter and all the surfaces for two reasons. First reason being that the engineer is going to get a portfolio of photos on this, and as he constantly tells me, there's no such thing as too much information. So the better the welds look, the better the portfolio is going to look. So that's the first reason, and second reason being it's a better surface for all the paint to stick to. So I can go through now and I can see in the flat section of the chassis rail for the strapping to sit on top of, and I can keep plugging away at it. So let's keep plugging. Hot tip for notch strapping, not to say that you have to do it this way, this is just the way that I tend to do it. I'll run a piece of masking tape full length front to back along the profile of the notch. That way I've got an accurate true length, and I've got something I can mark up just with a permanent marker where all the change of directions are. I'll then just get a bit of scrap I've got kicking around, and I'll cut that to suit the profile of the notch, so I've got something to bend the strapping against rather than just using your knee or the side of a gas bottle or whatever you got kicking around that you then need to use 5 extra clamps that you shouldn't have had to use to get the notch strapping in place. With these straps, I've had these cut out of a 2.4 sheet. It's still too short, with the size of the notch being the size of the notch. So they're 70mm short. So I'm just gonna add that 70mm to the top straps here now, and we'll keep moving forward. Alright, that's the top side of the chassis notch all welded out. That was over 9.5 meters worth of weld. So even with the PFC at the back there as a counterweight, it still wanted to lift a tiny bit, so I threw a trolley jack on top just to add a little bit of extra weight to keep it on the ground where we need it. But it's welded out. So I've laid some nice big sausage style welds here with a good bit of overlap on the start stops to minimize the low spots I may have to fill by the time this all gets smoothed out. I'm going to go ahead now and cut the center of the chassis out. With this being a C-channel style chassis, I think I'm going to get away with just using a 5-inch grinder. So let's get this lopped out, and then we can do it all again on the underside. So prior to strapping this side out, I went ahead and I seam welded all 4 sides, and I poked the glue gun in all 4 pockets, top and bottom, as far as I could get it. But the reality of said situation is that doing this underside strapping sucks. Welding upside down also sucks, and I'm practically a crab on its back at the moment on this creeper, which is pretty unattractive to look at. So rather than trying to time lapse this and make it look half cool, the reality is that it sucks. So I'm probably just gonna do the other side. I'll weld both sides out, and then I'll give you a look at the finished product. So let's wrap it up. Alright guys, that's the notch all wrapped up. Once I had this thing fully welded out, I went through with a grinding disc just to knock the high spots down on all the weld. I then went back through again with a 36 grit sanding pad just to smooth it out and give it a little bit of a radius. I spent an entire day on a 5-inch grinder and I've done a 50 pack of these things. So to this point here, I've got a little over a week in it. That might seem like a lot to some people because it's just a notch, but to put things in perspective, there's over 20 meters of weld just in the strapping. So I'm not talking about the plate to the rail, I'm not talking about boxing in the rail, I'm just purely talking about the upper and the lower strapping. There's over 20 meters of weld and half of that was overhead. So it took what it took, it's all wrapped up. That RHS bracing is just temporary, so that's gonna come back out. I'm gonna pull the rear end back in now. I'm going to throw that back in it. The truck will stay static for a period of time. And the 6BT that's going to go in it is still at the docks in the States, so it's been delayed. Because the truck's so large, it takes up a large piece of real estate, it'll leave for a period of time. It'll then come back. The motor might be mounted by then, it might not. We'll just see where it's at when it turns back up. But that's it. Wrapped up, all done. So I'm not saying you guys have to notch a truck this way. This is just how I notch this truck. This is how the engineer was happy with the truck being done, and it's obviously been done a specific way to suit a specific style airbag and to lay and to tow and to do all the stuff that a truck should do. So I know this was probably a bit of a long one, but I appreciate the time, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one.